Have you ever been in a situation or in a group setting where you are really trying to solve a problem and then you suddenly realize that even though everyone is smart individually, if you put all those individual heads together, there is this collective brain power. Or maybe you have seen situation where while group is so preoccupied with wrong details, but then one single individual makes a bold claim and then you realize maybe we should follow that person's guide. If only all the rest of the people, everyone, really listened and paid attention to escape group thinking. Well, today we are going to talk about those two contradictions as described by Aristotle. So, welcome back. This is a very timeless question. For thousands of years, humans wrestled with the idea of when to come together as a group to make collective action or when to set aside group thinking and follow the guide of one smart, confident, and virtuous leader. If you enjoy these episodes, please consider giving a like, leaving a comment, sharing with your friends, and subscribing to make sure to follow the upcoming episodes. This podcast is also available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. In each of those platforms, just search Philosophy Every Day and you'll find me there. Even though these Aristotle series are solo episodes, I will also have few guests, thought leaders from AI, philosophy, history, and so on. So I will have some of those interviews in the coming months and then we'll share them in all those channels. So keep following to see what's coming next. I'm also available on Instagram. This is how I started first. You can also search for Philosophy Every Day, dot after philosophy, and then you will find me there, where I sometimes share content. Okay, back to Aristotle and today's content. Is it better to be ruled by one very amazing person or solid system of laws? And where does the collective wisdom group, the many, the multitude fit in? Answering that question really defines what makes any community, from smallest level of unit upscale to the global community of, let's say, humanity. What makes these communities work in practice? This part of the book that starts with chapter 15 in many ways seems like Aristotle is going to contradict the points he made previously about absolute monarchy, the rule of one supreme individual, being the most ideal regime in paper. And that's no surprise, because this is classic Aristotelian logic. Throughout the book, he constantly makes contradictory claims, statements, and then tests them against one another, so that maybe at the end of the day, we can come up with theory of one best regime. Okay, back to our question. Is it better to be ruled by the one supreme individual, one best man, or the best laws? Very timeless question. The arguments for the best person, Aristotle lays them out, is that laws are too universal. They can't adapt to every situation. Real life is messy. Imagine a doctor following just a handbook, just the operations, without being allowed to make any judgment in critical cases. For the most of the time, probably doctor can do well just by following the guidelines, but in some critical cases, his or her judgment will be needed, and that will determine probably, let's say, the operation, if he or she is performing a very important surgery. The point here is flexibility. Laws are universal, they are very general, whereas real wise rulers, real wise individuals can adapt and be flexible in novel situations. That's the argument for the best man, rule of the best man, as opposed to rule of the best system of laws. One supreme individual can deliberate in finer fashion in novel situations. They can see small details that some other people are missing or is not articulated in the system of the laws. Sounds good, but then Aristotle presents a counter argument to these claims. Even the best rulers are still human and flawed, whereas laws are stripped of passions, emotions like anger, jealousy. So rulers are still necessary, where laws can't foresee particular but they should act under law, not above it. Law doesn't get angry, law doesn't get jealous, but even the best rulers are still human and they may be flawed. Okay, then the question becomes even more specific. Okay, we ruled out that usually if the issue is universal, then laws should apply. But for those things that laws are unable to judge, since they are universal and do not consider particulars at every single time, you can't write down every single situation and how to act in that given situation. Should one person make a judgment or everyone? Here, the wisdom of the crowd enters the conversation very unexpectedly of Aristotle. If you watched the previous episode where he argued for the rule of one supreme individual. What do we mean by wisdom of the crowd? Aristotle says that single ruler is easier to be corrupted. One person's anger, one person's greed is enough to make that person corrupted. But it is very hard to corrupt a collective of free citizens. And here we are not talking about just one big mob. These are the people that follow the rules, follow the law, relatively reasonable people, free citizens. So this group of people is difficult to be corrupted compared to one single individual. Their judgments balance out one another like a wisdom of the crowd. So on average, crowd judges better than any single person. Think of it as if aggregation of perspectives and judgments all together. So multitude of people, multitude of free citizens that are reasonable are more incorruptible compared to one single individual. My comment here is that we see that this is not really true. You can easily find cases where one charismatic leader can easily play the public, and there is usually a bias for average people to follow the group because it's costly. It's relatively rare for one person to be exception and go against the group. But anyway, this is something that Aristotle doesn't consider in this situation, I believe. Uh, it is really easy to also play the public if you are very charismatic, if you have a very good public speaking skills, if you know how to play the crowd. But anyway, back to the argument that Aristotle is laying out. This multitude should be free citizens, generally reasonable people, generally well educated people, not any mob, but engaged citizenry. So it is one person might get corrupted, but it is difficult uh, compared to the one person to corrupt engaged citizenry when they come together. Okay, so we first started with the question of, is it better to be ruled by one single person or best system of the laws? The answer that Aristotle laid out is that uh, usually the system of the laws should take precedence, but in those cases where law is unable to judge, then it is better to rely on the judgment of the multitude of free, educated, reasonable citizens, engaged citizenry. So far, so good. But if the collection of free citizens' judgments usually trumps over the judgment of the one single individual that can be easily corrupted because of flaws, jealousy, anger, greed, then why did we have kingship in the first place? Why did we have monarchy in the history in the first place? Okay, then he starts going into talking about political cycles that happens in all the communities. He references back some probably a little bit nostalgically good old times, where he says cities, political communities first started with kings. Because back then, when humans got together for the first time, virtue was very rare. Usually, what would happen is that collection of people would see who is helping the most, who's helping the community the most, and then they would select that person as a king. In some ways, being king was, in that sense, meritocratic, not based on necessarily hereditary at the first. Kings were chosen because they did something better for the community and because they were virtuous. But as time passed, as knowledge spread, as education became more available, rule widened to aristocracy and then ultimately to the polity. Because over time, it wasn't the case anymore that there was only one person, one virtuous person. Now we had a lot of people. And when we say polity, it is not strict democracy, but mixed government, governed by law, aimed at common good, ruled by majority for the benefit of the common good, not for the benefit of the majority. So there he makes a very clear distinction between what is polity and what is democracy. Democracy, according to Aristotle, is when majority decides to do anything that majority pleases, even if that means violating the rights of the minority. But in polity, it's not as simple as that. A majority can't decide everything, can't violate everything because of whatever it pleases. Okay, first we had kingship because it was very rare to find an individual with supreme virtue. Then, as people became more virtuous, knowledge spread, education spread, then ultimately we ended up with the polity in some city states. But then what happened is that citizens became self interested. And in that situation, making money, having wealth became a priority. It became a symbol of status in a society. And this gets corrupted the moral life of the community, where now having wealth was seen as differentiating factor in a city. And then this corruption pushed the system into oligarchy, rule of the few wealthy people for their own benefit. And then what happened later on is that these oligarchs, they built tyranny, and then tyranny became democracy. Why? Because at the end of the day, majority of the people lacking wealth rose up, since because they are majority, and they revolted and they destroyed this tyranny, and then result was the establishment of democracy. Think of this as Aristotle's version of political history, but logically it makes sense. Central argument here is that law plus the collective wisdom of the virtues many is the safest, most just form of rule. Monarchy can be the best in paper, but only under extraordinary cases. Now let me pause here to make something really clear. Aristotle or most ancient Greek or Roman philosophy does not see equality as a moral principle in itself, the way modern societies often do. He would never argue to widen participation just because it is fair thing to do. Aristotle does not consider equality or egalitarianism as a virtue the way modern societies do. I think equality is something that entered the European philosophy with mainly after maybe Christianity and later on with the Enlightenment thinking. For Aristotle and most philosophers, I think it also applies to Plato. Being able to make correct judgments, having the right education, and having virtue is the prerequisite for wider participation in community. He actually despises promoting equality for the sake of equality in his criticism of democracies. He doesn't think widening political participation is good in itself. It can be good, but not as in itself. For him, only those with the education, discipline, and character to judge should rule. He sees democracy as flawed, precisely because it treats equality as the highest principle, giving power to the wise and the ignorant alike. Aristotle would say that is not justice, but that's reckless. So that's why he prefers polity. He considers polity a just form of government compared to democracy. So yes, in polity, still majority of the people participate, but they do so for the sake of common good, not for the benefit of the majority. So equality as a moral principle is not a Greek or Roman invention. Aristotle thought that democracy was dangerous, radical form of democracy was dangerous precisely because it confused equality with virtue. And when I say democracy, take it with skepticism because what was considered democracy back in ancient Greece is very different than what we consider democracy in today's world. When he mentions democracy, he's referring to basically types of governance where people are selected based on random choice, no mentioning of meritocracy, but which is not really the case these days. I think today's world, today's democracies resemble more Aristotle's idea of polity, where there is a protection of law. There are certain things that even if majority wants to do it, it can't do it because it might be illegal. And that's what Aristotle also considered ideal. Okay, that's about the chapter 15. Uh, Wisdom of the crowd entered the conversation. Yes, monarchy is desirable if there is a one supremely virtuous individual, but on average, most of the time, wisdom of the crowd is better because one single individual is more prone to corruption. Chapter 16, the next segment, Aristotle goes heavier, even heavier with his criticism of absolute rule of one individual. We are told that it is not in accordance with nature for one person among similar citizens to have authority over all matters. So justice, he says, dictates that if people are similar in terms of virtue, in terms of education, in terms of capacity for reasoning, they should have similar treatment regarding honors. Therefore, it is no more just for equal persons to rule than to be ruled, implying that they should rule and be ruled by turns. It is unnatural for one to rule absolutely over others if these people are similar, equal in terms of virtue. Justice requires equals to be ruled and to rule in turn. Rotation in the society of equals. An absolute rule by one violates this. So let's think of an example. Let's say there's a group project at university or even in the workplace or even in a small community. Say you've got 10 people, and for the sake of argument, let's say they have the same education, they have the same similar experience in life, same rational capacity to make judgments. Would it make sense for just one person to have the final say every time in this situation? No, since they are equals in ability. Justice among them means they should take turns, sometimes leading, sometimes following, depending on a situation, depending on a task. That's Aristotle's point. Among equals, it is unjust for one to always rule and the others to always obey. Fairness in this situation means rotation, ruling and being ruled in turn. So equality in this sense, in Aristotelian sense, is allowed only among equals. I think he would say in that, let's say in this 10 people example, if one person had, let's say, even higher level of experience and education, he would say, okay, it's better for that person to rule in that scenario because that person is more educated, more virtuous, maybe. So equality enters the conversation according to Aristotelian logic among equals. What is the purpose of the law? What is the significance of the law according to Aristotle? There is a very strong quote, very interesting, I think very amazing quote that says, one who asks law to rule seems to be asking God and intellect alone to rule, while one who asks man adds the beast. It's a very strong reminder of flawed and messy nature of human being. Emotion, bias, jealousy, anger, and unchecked raw power gives a reason for all these emotions to run free. So law here is described as an intellect, almost like a god, meaning that it is free from passion and desire, unlike human rulers. Human rulers can be corrupted by anger or some other form of passion, or act with a view for favor or spite or jealousy. Law is impartial, free from passion. Human rulers, however, are swayed by anger, greed, or favoritism in situations. So that's the argument for the existence of the laws, relying on laws than, let's say, one single individual. Terrifying thought experiment. Imagine a doctor being bribed by one's enemies to kill a patient rather than help the patient. In that scenario, absolutely everyone would demand written rules, written laws, or in other words, impartiality. You wouldn't automatically trust the judgment of the doctor if you knew that that person can be swayed by anyone without any reference to any written rules or regulations. You would need rules, written laws, documentation, systems to protect you in those cases. So, need for impartiality uh, results in the need for laws, system of the laws. Another example, heavily regulated industry, airlines. How do you know that How do you know that pilot won't just fly wherever they like to fly or crash the plane all of a sudden? Because they follow written procedure starting from takeoff up until landing. There's a protocol every step of the way. Doctors, when they get sick, what do? They seek the advice of other doctors. They want to see other doctors. Even experts don't trust themselves and seek impartiality in some cases. They seek collective judgment of other experts. So if even experts can't fully trust themselves in these novel situations, how can we trust one single individual every single time when it comes to making decisions for the community as a whole? And it is very difficult for one person to oversee everything. It is not easy for one person to survey many things. Therefore, even an absolute ruler would need to select a number of people, ministers, counselors, to rule under him or her. And another argument is that if a single excellent person is just to rule, then two good persons are better than the one. These arguments in total in chapter 16 present a strong case against absolute kingship, emphasizing the dangers of human passion and benefits of impartiality in the form of system of laws, and benefits of collective judgment and the rule of law. Aristotle doesn't deny that a single virtuous ruler could exist, but here he stresses that even so, laws and multiple good rulers outperform one man because of impracticality, practical limits and impartiality, need for impartiality. Okay, at this point, it seems like the debate is over. Everything is clear. But on chapter 17, Aristotle switches the gears again in a very similar Aristotelian fashion. While it all makes sense, all these arguments, all these points make sense, reality is messy. In some cases, these arguments hold, but in others, maybe not. Classic Aristotelian move. Just when you think argument is over, he introduces another counter argument. Says, no, wait, don't be so confident about these arguments just yet. He tests arguments, he steps back, and then reopens the questions. Specific circumstances where absolute kingship might be indeed just and advantageous. He makes a claim that people are different, and then he levels it up a bit further and says that some people are naturally apt for kingship, to be ruled by kings. Some are naturally apt to be ruled by aristocrats, while in others it is better that there is a polity. But it's explicitly stated that tyranny and other deviant regimes, tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, are contrary to nature. Check out the previous episodes, specifically part 6, where I discuss this typology of Aristotle's 6 different regimes, why he considers tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy deviant regimes, while considering monarchy, aristocracy, and polity correct, just, suitable regimes. So people have different temperaments. So here in this case, in this scenario, we see the Aristotle of 2,500 years ago. So this is a time uh, where people have a lot of views about other people. Let's say if you ask Aristotle, if you had a time machine and went back, if you ask Aristotle, which type of people do you consider more morally superior, he would say Greeks, and he would call all the other people as barbarians. But we can't really judge Aristotle because of that. They didn't have the technology that we have today. They didn't have the ethics that we have today. So that's also why this idea is coming from. He's saying that some people, it's better for them to be ruled by monarchs, some people aristocracy, some people polity. Okay, let's go back to the point about rule of the one supreme individual. Given everything that he said about the disadvantages of absolute rule, when can it ever be justified? When is it okay to have one person to have total control? Strongest justification for absolute kingship arises when an entire family or even a single individual is so outstanding in virtue that this virtue is more prominent than that of all the rest of the people, God among people. So in such a unique case, it is considered just for that family or single individual to be a kingly one with absolute unconstrained authority. So he's saying that it would be improper and unnatural to subject such a supremely virtuous person to to conventional rule or requiring to be ruled in turn. You can't treat these people as equal, Aristotle says. Therefore, for a person of such exceptional virtue, all that remains is for a person of this sort to be obeyed. So we go back to original argument of monarchy that we laid out in part 7 of this series. Monarchy being the ideal regime in paper. But it's in very rare circumstances. They are law in themselves, these supreme individuals. They represent the whole, while subjects are part. Crucial point to remember here is that the only real justification for absolute kingship is preeminent virtue, so extraordinary that it surpasses all others. If you don't have it, then monarchy collapses into tyranny. So, the earlier, what Aristotle was saying, that it is in the community of equals. Remember that analogy that we did with the 10 people in the group project. Among the equal people, equality is justified. But equality ends where extraordinary virtue begins. When this rare circumstance is present, then the monarchy is the best form of regime, according to Aristotle. Think about the AI, yes, with all the discussions about super intelligent AI coming in the future. Imagine AI in the future surpasses human beings in wisdom, in objective rule. Would it be unnatural to not to obey the AI rule? Would it be better choice to let AI rule everyone if AI is supremely virtuous, they can make all the objective judgments, choices. So this is a very interesting argument because, of course, back in ancient Greece, human beings, and Aristotle considers like this is what makes human beings different than the other animals. Yes, human beings are political animals. They can make judgments. They are rational. But nowadays, it seems likely that in the future, human beings will not be the only creatures in the planet that can make rational arguments, that can make deliberation, that can make choices. So it's an interesting idea. Okay, back to the rule of the one supreme individual. But what's the downside? What Aristotle doesn't consider here is that it is very easy for people to confuse charisma with virtue. Because some people are just naturally very good at playing to public, playing to crowds, making people believe that they are virtuous. But Aristotle doesn't consider this problem just yet in this chapter, but it is very relevant today in the age of mass media. We are living in the age of mass communications where you have social media and everything where it's very easy to reach millions of people just from your home. Moving on to the final chapter of Book 3. This part sets the stage for later discussion of best regimes. We go back to the Aristotle's reminder about the 3 correct regimes and 3 deviant regimes. Monarchy, aristocracy, polity, these are considered correct regimes. Tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, they are considered corrupt regimes, according to Aristotle. In the best regime, Aristotle says, the virtue of good citizen and good person must be the same. Remember our previous discussions? I think we touched upon this in the part 5 of this series. Virtue of a good citizen is doing what the regime requires, but virtue of a good person is doing what universal morality requires. Justice, discipline, courage, friendship. Aristotle says that in the best possible regime, virtue of a good citizen and virtue of the good person must be the same. Laws are best, rulers are so virtuous, and so by following the law and the commands of, let's say, rulers, you also become good man in universal sense. You're a good person in universal sense. Superhero stories often touch this theme. Is Batman a good citizen and a good person? You may make a very perfectly reasonable argument that he is a bad citizen because he does not follow the rules very strictly. He operates above the law sometimes. But you can also make a case that he is a good person because ultimately he strives for justice in his own way. If you follow this line of argument, you can make a claim that This misalignment in Batman is because the regime in which Batman operates is unjust. In this case, Batman is not a good citizen, but he's a good person. So Aristotle's argument here is that virtue of the good person is the same as the virtue of the good citizen in the best possible regime. Because best possible regimes, they promote the virtue of being a good person. They promote justice, they promote education, they promote discipline, courage, friendship. By the way, he talks about all these virtues that I just listed: courage, friendship, discipline, and all the rest in the other book, Nicomachean Ethics. Actually, I would be very interested in the future to do series on that as well, because that's also another very fundamental book. That book fundamentally touches upon this, like, final, like, what does it mean to be a good person? What's the purpose of life? Superhero stories, the one that we gave about Batman, often circle back to this Aristotelian question: what is the difference between being a good citizen and being a good person? Batman, by Aristotle's standards, he's a bad citizen. He doesn't follow the city's laws, doesn't operate within its institutions, and often undermines the authority of Gotham's officials, the city of Batman. But is he a good person? Arguably, yes, because his actions are driven by a commitment to justice. That is his end goal, even when the law fails. In Aristotle's terms, this mismatch happens when the regime itself is corrupt or unjust. A good person, according to Aristotle, might have to break the laws, might have to break the rules of the city if those rules do not reflect universal justice. In the best possible regime, these two align with each other. Batman is a classic Aristotelian misfit: bad citizen, good person. But in the best possible regime promotes the universal justice through education and cultivation of habits in every single citizen. That's why it's called the best regime, and that's why he says that in this regime, virtue of the good person is the same as the virtue of the good citizen. To summarize, what did we discuss today? In those cases where laws cannot decide because they're universal, and sometimes some particular cases, some novel situations require further judgment, usually it is better to rely on the wisdom of the crowd, given that people in this crowd are equal in virtue, in reasoning capacity. While rare, if there is one supreme individual or one supreme family, it makes sense to let them rule, because it is unjust to treat them as equal. So that's what Aristotle argued. And in best possible regimes, virtue of the good person must equal virtue of the good citizen, because logically it makes sense. If the regime promotes these ideas of universal justice, which must be the same with the virtues of the good person, because virtue of the good person is related to universal morality, concepts that I just introduced, like courage, discipline, etc. Thanks a lot for listening to this. If you enjoyed listening to this, please consider liking, commenting, leaving a review in Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This is available in YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. Just search philosophy every day. If you want to send me a message, also feel free to send me an Instagram. Again, philosophy.everyday is how you can find me in Instagram. If some of these concepts seem difficult to grasp, please also watch the previous episodes. Many of the concepts that I talked about today follows from the concepts that I have introduced in the previous parts. Thanks a lot for watching. Have a good day.